Trying to get to the U.S., the Coast Guard reporting they have intercepted the sub in the Pacific Ocean, finding more than 12,000 pounds of cocaine on board.
It started with a ghost ship. No name, no flag, no signal, creeping through a smuggler's lane in the Caribbean. A U.S. destroyer closed in.
Hey, we need to get him over on a boat!
Its helicopter circling above, while Coast Guard teams prepared to board.
We simulated having a Hellfire on the wing of the aircraft, and we found a target to engage with.
What they found on deck was only the beginning. Hidden compartments, suspicious cargo, and a cartel connection worth millions. But the real shock came later, when investigators realized this mysterious boat was tied to something far bigger than anyone expected. The ghost ship in the Caribbean. The morning of May 25th, 2025, was the kind that makes the ocean look harmless. Then a dot appeared on a scope. No name, no flag, no AIS ping. Just a hull sliding along a lane smugglers use when they try to move between the top of South America and the island passages to the north. If you wonder why no AIS matters, AIS is like a car's headlights at night. You can turn them off and still drive, but everyone around you will assume you are up to no good. Fishing crews use AIS because it keeps them from getting run down in the dark and helps them show where they are working. A maritime patrol aircraft called it in. The plane did not need a name to know something was off. Boats that belong there behave a certain way. They drift with nets. They motor in patterns that make sense for fishing. This one cut through a quiet patch like it owned the place and did not want anyone to notice. That was enough to wake people up. This was about 290 miles south of the Dominican Republic. On the other end of the radio sat a U.S. destroyer doing a job it was not built for originally, but was doing well anyway.
And it's a brand new crew where approximately about 140 of my 270 sailors.
USS Gravely had been on this beat since mid-March, moved under U.S. Northern Command to help watch the sea approaches toward the United States. If Northern Command sounds like a mouthful, think of it as the military's home defense headquarters for North America. They normally handle big-picture homeland missions. In spring of 2025, they added a destroyer to beef up eyes and presence in the Caribbean and Gulf waters that feed toward U.S. shores. A destroyer extends the reach of smaller cutters and Coast Guard patrols. It brings heavy sensors, steadier flight operations, and enough fuel and speed to chase leads long distances. Gravely was not alone. She carried a small, sharp Coast Guard team permanently on board. The kind of people whose job is to turn a hunch into a lawful stop. They were a law enforcement detachment.
That's the challenge. The majority of our sailors are young men and women who just joined the Navy from all over this country.
Lay Det 401. The boarding pros who know how to make first contact without making things worse. The ship also had a Navy helicopter unit with an MH-60R Seahawk. Picture a Black Hawk's cousin with a folding tail, stacked with sensors, and comfortable landing on a moving deck. The destroyer had help from P-8 Poseidon patrol jets out of Naval Air Station Jacksonville. Long-legged planes that stitch radar, infrared, and human eyes together so the ship knows where to look before something slips past. Back in the air, the patrol aircraft kept the target under watch. Maritime patrol aircraft do one thing well: find small stuff on a very big ocean and do not lose it. The crew called out speed, heading, and any sudden changes, anything that hinted somebody was nervous or trying to duck behind traffic. If the boat were legitimate, it would fly a flag and answer a radio hail. This one did neither. Boats dodge AIS sometimes, sure, but real fishing crews still show a flag and talk back when hailed. There was a larger network feeding this work. From Key West, a joint task force watches air and sea traffic all day and night. It is called Joint Interagency Task Force-South. Think Coast Guard people, military folks, and intelligence analysts in one room, sharing radar feeds and tips from partner nations, then handing targets to the closest ship or cutter. Their job is to detect and monitor, which means find it and keep eyes on it until a ship can act. When the plane sees something, they help sort it. Does it fit known routes? Is it flying a flag? Is it talking on the radio? And if no one owns it, who is close enough to check safely? That is how a plane's call becomes a warship's problem in minutes. When the call finally landed, the mission was to move in and make contact. The destroyer edged to where it needed to be. The aircrew tightened its circle. On the flight deck, the mood shifted from routine to focused. On the boat deck, gear was set out with the same muscle memory as a fire drill. No one was grandstanding. No one was guessing. The goal was simple: get close enough to identify, control the space, and keep everyone safe long enough to ask the right questions. Once Gravely had the target boxed in, the real test was stepping onto that deck. Boarding the cartel boat. The destroyer did not rush in like a movie chase. It eased forward, slow and deliberate, until its massive gray hull sat just off the suspect boat's quarter.
The U.S. Coast Guard, they released video of a dramatic bust in the Pacific off Latin America.
The positioning was no accident. The captain kept the angle perfect, close enough that the smaller boat could feel the presence of a warship towering beside it, but not so close that a sudden swell would send fiberglass slamming against steel. The Seahawk helicopter circled overhead, its rotor wash beating down like a steady drum. You could feel the vibration in your chest, even on Gravely's deck. The Swamp Fox's aircrew inside kept their eyes locked on the target with radar and infrared cameras, ready to call out every twitch of the boat below. Every few seconds, encrypted radios carried updates straight to Gravely's bridge. Speed, heading, even the slight waver in the suspect's line of travel. On Gravely's boat deck, sailors were already moving fast. They dragged out the RHIBS, rigid-hulled inflatables, each 136 feet long and built for speed. These weren't dinghies. They were high-performance intercept craft that could scream past 46 miles per hour and still hold tight control.
These U.S. Coast Guard crews, guns drawn, seizing a small drug smuggling vessel.
They sat low in the water, steady even when waves slapped, able to cut shallow where bigger boats would run aground. The crews knew the RHIBS like their own cars. Engines were checked, radios synced, and the Coast Guard boarding team climbed aboard with practiced ease. The Coast Guard detachment riding with Gravely took the lead. 10 men and women in tactical gear checked their helmets, body armor, and flotation vests. They spoke little because they did not have to. Every move had been drilled countless times. Who carried the medical bag? Who handled photos? Who spoke the opening lines in Spanish or English? Who stood first in line to step across the gap? The Navy provided the ship and the muscle. The Coast Guard brought the badge, the law, and the training to make this encounter more than intimidation. Then the radio call came. Approach authorized. The destroyer's loud hailer boomed across the water, steady and professional. Identify your vessel, show your flag, slow your engine and maintain your course. Keep hands visible. At the same time, the Seahawk adjusted its orbit, careful not to blast the suspect boat with downwash, but close enough that its shadow loomed unmistakably. The RHIBs surged forward, one sliding to starboard, the other offset to port. They never cut head-on, never gave the suspect boat a chance to swing wide, and trapped them in the bow wake. Engines idled low as the coxswains matched speed almost perfectly, drawing within yards of the target. The Coast Guard team stood ready at the bow, rifles slung low, not raised, but ready if hands went the wrong way. Voices stayed calm. No screaming, no threats. The tension lay in the silence, the unspoken fact that an American destroyer, a helicopter, and 2 fast boats now had this mystery hull boxed in. From the deck of the suspect boat, the view must have been surreal. Any innocent fisherman would have been waving papers and flags by now. These men weren't. They stayed stiff, hands at their sides, eyes darting in a little too many directions. The boarding officer spoke again, this time through a handheld loudhailer. If you have a flag, show it now. If you don't, declare stateless. At sea, a flag isn't decoration. It's your country's fingerprint. Without it, you're a vessel without a nation. And that meant Gravely had the authority to stop and search. Every detail was being recorded. The Coast Guard boarding officers wore body cameras clipped to their vests. The RHIBs had additional cameras rolling.
These U.S. Coast Guard crews, guns drawn, seizing a small drug smuggling vessel.
Photos of the boat's condition, its course, the sea state, and the first words exchanged. Everything was logged. Not because guilt was certain, but because every step needed to be preserved. The record would back the boarding team if challenged later, and it would protect the crew of the suspect vessel if anyone claimed abuse. The approach turned tense when the suspect boat's crew froze instead of responding. Smugglers sometimes go oddly quiet, betting that silence will stall the boarding party. But silence reads worse than defiance. The swamp foxes spotted one man moving toward the stern, crouching by a hatch. Instantly, the call went over the encrypted net. Movement aft, left side, near the hatch. The boarding officer's tone shifted sharply. Stay where you are. Hands visible. The coxswains eased closer, keeping parallel, ready to lunge forward if the suspect boat tried a sudden escape. On Gravely's bridge, the captain ordered a slow turn, bringing the destroyer just a few dozen yards tighter, closing off the escape lane. The massive shadow of the warship stretched over the water, boxing the small boat in like a spotlight. Then came the step. One Coast Guard officer, steady on the RHIB's bow, shifted across the narrow gap onto the suspect's deck. It was not a leap, not reckless, just a practiced step, low and balanced. In a blink, 3 more followed, spreading wide to cover corners. Rifles low, eyes scanning hatches and hands. One officer addressed the crew directly, Spanish clear and firm. "We are the U.S. Coast Guard. For your safety and ours, keep your hands visible." The crew stayed stiff, but no one lunged. The boarding team fanned out, checking corners, eyeing tarps that fluttered in the wrong wind, and noting seams on deck that looked fresh painted. A trained ear could tell if a bulkhead rang hollow when tapped, evidence of a hidden compartment.
The series of raids carried out over the past few months in the Pacific, even catching semi-submersibles.
They worked fast but calmly. Up above, the Seahawks camera zoomed close, feeding Gravely's bridge live video of every move. From the RHIBs, coxswains kept engines in gear, ready to peel out or ram if the suspect boat went hostile. From Gravely's deck, sailors leaned over rails, watching but not interfering, knowing this was now Coast Guard space. With the crew under control, the search began, and what they uncovered was staggering. The massive discovery on board. Once the deck was under control, the boarding team turned to the search. What looked harmless under the morning sun was now suspicious under practiced eyes. A hatch that seemed ordinary got a second pull. The air itself told a story. Diesel and salt, yes, but threaded with a faint chemical sweetness. You only notice if you've smelled it before. To a veteran, that was the first whisper that this boat carried something no fishing skiff should. Hints hardened into proof under a tarp. Square bundles, sharp-cornered and dense. Nothing like the messy gear or bait boxes you'd see on a working boat. Each one was packed in a way cartels have perfected. Rough burlap on the outside, heavy plastic inside. Layers locked down so water couldn't creep in, and the shape stayed rigid for long runs at sea. These bricks were built for stacking low and even, a design meant to keep a hull riding smooth enough that casual eyes wouldn't spot the weight. On top of that, cartel fingerprints showed through. Traffickers stamped their product, sometimes with letters, with logos, even with pop culture knockoffs, so everyone in the chain knows who owns what. There are seizures in Uruguay where bricks bore the YouTube logo. In Peru, police have pulled bales marked with swastikas and the word Hitler. The marks themselves change, but the meaning never does. They're claim checks in a dirty business.
58 kilograms of cocaine, which were handed for Belgium in packages bearing Nazi symbols and the name of Hitler.
Here, the packaging told the same story. This wasn't small time. Counting came next. First on the spot, then again, later on shore. The boarding team logged the bundles, one after another, knowing the number would matter as much as the weight. The Navy's first report spelled it out. 19 bales weighing about 860 pounds, with a street value they pegged at roughly $13.65 million. That was the fast release, the one meant to show the public results. Later, the Coast Guard confirmed its own tally. 19 bales again, this time weighed at about 840 pounds and tagged with a valuation of $6.2 million. Different agencies, different formulas. While the packages were logged, the human side played out with equal care. The crew of the suspect boat, now detainees, were treated as people first. They were ordered to keep their hands visible, but they were also given water, shade, and medical checks. Sunburn, dehydration, cuts. Anything visible was treated on the spot. A boarding officer collected names, ages, and claimed ports of departure and destination. If someone spoke only Spanish, a bilingual officer bridged the gap. No grilling, no interrogations. That would come later, when federal agents had the case ashore. Evidence work began immediately. Body-worn cameras never stopped recording. The video locked the timeline. What was said, what was found, who touched what. Tamper-proof seals went on every sample, so if a bag was ever opened without the right witness, it would scream foul in court.
Ships like these that seize more than 90% of the total cocaine captured by U.S. authorities.
Chain of custody wasn't a buzzword. It was the thread that tied that morning's discovery to a courtroom months later. Each bale got an ID number. Field kits tested small slices where conditions allowed, giving an initial confirmation without tearing open the entire stash. The rest stayed sealed for proper labs later. Stamps on the wrappings were photographed, but not exaggerated. The officers knew better than to speculate which cartel owned the load. That was for investigators on land. Moving detainees and evidence from the suspect boat to Gravely was its own operation. The detainees went first, cuffed, life jackets strapped on, then carefully guided into the waiting RHIBs before being lifted aboard the destroyer. They were logged in, photographed, and placed in a secure space under watch. The bales followed with equal care. Each seal was read aloud, recorded, photographed, and matched to the log before the package left the deck. They were loaded into the RHIBs low and stable, never stacked high where a hard turn could send one sliding into the sea. On Gravely, a designated space waited, cool, dry, guarded, and accessible only through a strict sign-in, sign-out protocol. Every number matched. Every transfer had a name and a time. No gaps meant no cracks for a defense attorney to exploit later. That same week, Gravely wasn't alone. Other ships were busy in the region. Valiant, William Hall, Friesland, Vigorous, all pulling loads off boats trying to run the same corridors. That mattered because Gravely wasn't built to carry detainees or evidence back to port for days at a time. That role belonged to cutters. Vigorous, a 210-foot Coast Guard cutter, was assigned to receive the haul. The transfer at sea was steady, like a shift change. Pallets moved. Seal numbers were read and reread. A Coast Guard photographer snapped every bale as it came aboard. For the boarding team, the scene on the pier days later carried its own satisfaction. Rows of sealed bales lined under the Florida sun, forklifts moving them to storage, cameras flashing. That week's Coast Guard offload was bigger than most people would guess. Over $138 million worth of narcotics seized in just 6 separate busts. The cutter Valiant alone unloaded more than 17,000 pounds of cocaine and another 2,500 pounds of marijuana. Canada's William Hall and the Dutch ship Friesland each added their own seizures to the pile, but they were still part of the same coordinated push that squeezed a smuggling lane until it coughed up multiple loads in just a matter of days. To understand the weight of that discovery, you have to follow the trail back to the cartels that launched it, and the storm that losing millions in product sets off in their world. The cartel behind the bales, and the fallout that followed. The boat never needed a painted logo to reveal its origin. The route said it all. South of Hispaniola, edging toward Puerto Rico and the Mona Passage, there's a corridor that traffickers have used for decades. Colombian syndicates based on the Caribbean coast, together with partners in Venezuela, have long pushed loads north in go-fast boats and low-profile craft. Once those vessels make it far enough, Dominican and Puerto Rican crews step in. These are men who know the currents, the reefs, the hidden channels, and the gaps in radar better than most fishermen. Years of arrests, indictments, and seizures map out the same pattern. So when a U.S. destroyer and its Coast Guard detachment dragged one of these boats from the shadows, the underworld didn't ask, "How did they find us?" The only question was, who's paying for this? The cocaine economy runs on credit. Shipments are fronted down the line and paid only when they arrive. When a load vanishes at sea, someone suddenly owes someone else millions. And the debt doesn't wait. Phones start buzzing.
Male narco-terrorists aboard the vessel were killed in the strike, and no U.S. forces were harmed in the operation.
Who bankrolled the run? Which broker staked a share? Which crew botched the job? Every missing bale carries a name, and the math turns brutal. The fallout moves quickly because cartels survive by adapting. Routes shift overnight. A decoy boat goes out alongside the real one. Crews launch during storms when radar is blind. Fresh loads are rushed north to keep wholesalers in island hubs from defecting to rival suppliers. They can move so quickly because the supply is immense. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime reported record highs for both cocaine production and seizures in 2024 and 2025. With a pool that deep, one lost shipment hurts, but doesn't cripple a major network. Still, each missing load sparks a scramble. To trace who likely owned this one, investigators zoom out. On Colombia's Caribbean side, in Urabá, Córdoba, and Bolívar, the Clan del Golfo has long controlled transport. They use fishermen as cover and shallow estuaries as staging points. When pressure builds, launches shift west toward Panama or east across the Gulf of Venezuela to the coasts of Falcón and Zulia, where corruption greases the process. From those beaches, the quickest run to U.S. waters is a sprint north to Hispaniola or directly into Puerto Rico. The handoff is what makes the system tick.
Now, Venezuela is accusing the U.S. Navy of boarding a fishing boat in Venezuelan waters.
Dominican crews don't just move loads because they're available. They do it because they blend in. In the Mona Passage, their boats are indistinguishable from legitimate traffic. When they succeed, the cocaine either pauses briefly in stash houses along Puerto Rico's north coast or gets broken up and passed to smaller crews. From there, it might move in small boats toward the U.S. Virgin Islands, or slip into flights and parcels. At that stage, the same interagency team that spotted the boat at sea, JIATF South in Key West, CBP's Air and Marine Operations, and Coast Guard aircraft out of San Juan, passes the baton to land-based units. That means the Caribbean Corridor Strike Force and the Caribbean Border Interagency Group, DEA, FBI, Homeland Security Investigations, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and others. Their mission is simple: follow the phones and the money until a nameless hull leads to real names, faces, and accounts. The traffickers leave breadcrumbs even when they try not to. Packaging is one of the biggest tells. Bales are often stamped with logos, animals, or numbers. Those stamps work like claim checks, letting financiers track whose product is whose. Once the packages are seized, DEA chemists run them through the cocaine signature program. By analyzing trace chemicals, they can pinpoint whether a batch came from Colombian, Peruvian, or Bolivian labs, and sometimes even narrow it to a region or network. When those results line up with bale stamps, investigators can map supply chains, spotting which marks keep reappearing on American shores. Phones are another weak link. Smugglers don't gab on marine radios. Analysts immediately dig into call logs, GPS pings, and even notes scribbled on scraps of paper. That's how a single nameless seizure at sea becomes a sprawling conspiracy case on land. In fact, The Caribbean Corridor Strike Force has stacked up case after case where go-fast interceptions near Puerto Rico led to Dominican crew arrests and then indictments of their handlers ashore.
The more traditional drug smuggling routes in the Caribbean are having an uptick in activity.
When pressure rises, traffickers diversify. One method is the rip-on, rip-off tactic in container ports. Smugglers slip cocaine into a legitimate container without the shipper knowing, then pull it at the destination. When that feels exposed, they go back to the sea with low-profile fiberglass boats that ride so low they almost vanish on radar. Several of those have been seized in the Caribbean recently. Another tactic is the use of motherships. Larger vessels that lurk offshore, refuel the go-fasts, or shift the cocaine to fishing boats for the final dash inland. Each tweak is meant to tilt the odds back until another patrol plane spots a faint wake where none should be. The same week this boat went down, the Caribbean was boiling with activity. By August 2025, the U.S. Coast Guard offloaded more than 76,000 pounds of cocaine at Port Everglades, Florida. That mountain of drugs came from multiple seizures and joint work with Dutch and Canadian partners, and it hammered the same networks running through Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. That's how a squeeze works. Different flags, same tempo, hitting the trade at once so smugglers can't simply steer around. So what happens to the crew? They face federal charges, often in Puerto Rico or South Florida. Prosecutors build cases on airtight evidence, but the deeper fallout happens back home. Debt rolls downhill. Middlemen who bankrolled fuel and supplies demand repayment. Recruiters who promised payouts disappear. Financiers who fronted the product demand accountability. When those demands aren't met, violence follows. It rarely makes headlines, but it shows up in burned hulls, fishermen who vanish, or stash houses suddenly robbed. Each is its own quiet warning. The last piece of fallout is one most people never think about: what the money would have become. Every bale that makes it north turns into cash that buys loyalty, bribes officials, builds new boats, and arms local bosses. Every bale seized at sea is money that never turns into a bribe, never funds a new go-fast, never buys an AK-47, and never fuels a feud that leaves bodies on the street. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.